Why was no one talking to her that morning? The briefing had ended early, the room still thick with dust and impatience. Command was pulling back every Overwatch team from the southern ridge. The forecast had shifted, and the storm was coming in faster than expected. The air outside already shimmered with rising wind, carrying threads of sand that looked like ghostly ropes dragging across the dirt. The younger snipers laughed as they packed their gear, teasing the storm like it was some harmless desert tantrum. But Quinn didn't laugh. She wasn't on the rotation anymore. Her name hadn't been spoken once in the meeting. Not in orders, not in dismissal, just silence. She walked out anyway, passing the others who moved in groups, tight, noisy clusters of confidence and routine. She moved like a shadow between them, unnoticed, or maybe ignored. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. The Overwatch shack where she spent most days leaned slightly west, its wooden panels warped by heat and time. It wasn't even marked as an active post anymore, fallback storage. That's what the roster called it. But she went there anyway, because no one told her not to. Inside, the room was small, barely wide enough for her stool, the scope rail, and a crate she used as a table. A place built for silence, for waiting, for being forgotten. Her rifle rested on the table, bolt action, matte black, worn smooth where her cheek had pressed too many times. No rails, no digital rangefinder. The others called it museum glass. They joked last month that her rifle still smelled like the Korean War. She smiled once at that joke, not because it was funny, but because she'd rather they laughed than remembered she was there. She ran a cloth over the bolt, feeling the metal catch ever so slightly. The drag annoyed her. She cleaned it the night before, not because anyone asked, but because precision was the only language she trusted. Outside, the wind picked up. The flag near the wall began to twitch with rhythm, steady, left push, 30 degrees, maybe 35. She noted it, marked it in her logbook. That logbook, the one she carried everywhere, looked older than her rifle. Its coil bindings were rusted, the pages soft like linen, filled with graphite arcs, range sketches, slope corrections, mirage adjustments. Numbers, angles, equations, all hers. Not for approval, not for training logs, just for order. When the world ignored her, the math never did. One of the gunners passed her earlier, laughing with a friend. "Careful," he said, "that museum scope might magnify the sun, melt her rifle clean through." His friend laughed so hard he coughed. Neither looked at her. She didn't answer, didn't flinch. She never had to. Instead, she adjusted the elevation knob half a click, smooth, silent. Then she looked through the scope, sweeping the horizon. The wash stretched before her, a sea of broken rock and pale dust that shimmered under the midday glare. The air moved in visible waves. Heat, mirage, distortion, a playground for mistakes, but not for her. She focused on a choke point, a low break between ridges where sand gathered thicker than anywhere else. She noted it in her book. No movement, no signal, no orders. But she stayed. That's what she did, stayed. The others would call it useless loyalty. She called it readiness. By late morning, command confirmed what she already knew. All snipers were pulled from field rotation. Except her, because they'd forgotten she was even listed. She didn't log off, didn't sign anything. She just watched the flag, watched the light shift from gold to white to gray. The shack creaked with every gust. Sand scraped the wall in steady rhythm, a dry, papery hiss. It wasn't peace, it was endurance. Through the lens, she could see the far ridge begin to fade in haze. The storm was building now, not yet violent, just restless. The kind of wind that made the air electric before the world breaks. And still, no one called for her. It had become normal, this exile in plain sight. That night the quarters were quieter than usual. Not the quiet of sleep, the quiet of tired laughter and background screens playing downloaded movies. The others stayed in clusters. She stayed in her bunk, her back against the wall, her logbook across her knees. The bulb above flickered every few minutes, making the shadows dance across her locker. The air smelled of oil and metal and human fatigue. She worked numbers again, not for approval, for clarity. Wind drift at 700 meters. Cross factor if dust distortion exceeds 20%. Mirage angle correction on sloped terrain. Her pencil moved steady, unhurried. Precision was her prayer. 3 pages back, she found an old calculation, one that had almost cost lives once. Just a decimal error, small enough to hide. She had caught it in time, but the memory of that mistake, that near miss, stayed under her skin like a scar that refused to fade. She flipped to the last page. There, folded neatly, was a piece of paper, her commendation, issued after her first deployment. The ink had bled from humidity and the bottom signature was missing. They credited a different officer for her correction. She'd been right. The shot that day would have missed. But the official report called it a minor adjustment, caught post-debrief. Her name was never mentioned. Still, she kept the paper. Not for pride, for proof that being invisible didn't mean being wrong. On the shelf above, a small brass watch ticked, mechanical, worn, a gift from her instructor years ago, a man who once told her, "Machines built before screens have more to teach." She believed that. Every night she wound it by hand, not because she needed the time, but because she needed something that obeyed her touch. The sound was faint, almost swallowed by the hum of pipes, but she could always find it. Tick, tick, tick. It reminded her that patience had a rhythm, too. Outside, the wind howled again, harder now, rattling loose tin, pushing dust against the corridor. Someone down the hall laughed, boots echoing as they passed her door. Another hummed a tune she didn't recognize. Quinn didn't move. She closed her logbook, set its spine down in her crate so the pages wouldn't curl, and leaned back. She didn't pray for clear weather, didn't hope for recognition. She only whispered something to herself, barely audible, words meant for no one. Tomorrow will hold. It wasn't faith, it was focus. The kind that comes when the world has already counted you out, but you keep showing up anyway. By the next afternoon, the wind wasn't just wind anymore. It was teeth. The flag outside the shack was stretched straight, snapping like gunfire against the pole. The horizon had turned the color of steel dust, not day, not night. The sky pressed down on the land like a weight. Quinn checked her scope again, adjusted for visibility. The lens was coated in grit. She wiped it once, steady, careful not to scratch. The radio crackled with half-words and static, calls of teams retreating, assets falling back. One drone feed failed, then another. The storm had killed the sky's eyes. That's when she saw it. Through the distortion, something moved. Not wind, not heat shimmer, movement. Slow, deliberate, human. She froze, watched, counted the seconds between flickers. 5-second intervals, formation packing. She reached for her radio, eyes on movement, ridge northeast, 5 silhouettes. Static. Then command's voice, negative contact, drone confirms no visuals, hold position. She pressed again. Direct line of sight confirmed, top arc behind stone crescent, repeat, possible formation. A pause, then a sharper voice, older, higher rank. That's a no, you're outside safe bracket, do not engage. The line went dead. Quinn didn't move, didn't blink. Her right cheek rested on the stock, left hand steady beneath the barrel. Through the haze, one figure dropped prone. Another adjusted something near their chest, long shape, too straight for debris. A rifle. Her pulse didn't rise, it never did, she trained it not to. Through the blur, she saw what command didn't, an enemy sniper setting up. And her own recon team, moving right into their sights. She tried the radio again, static. She was the only eye left. The only one who could see the danger forming through the storm. She exhaled slowly. Her hands moved with calm precision, the way others breathe before speaking. She checked elevation, adjusted windage, 2 clicks left. The range was 1,230 meters. Too far, they'd say, too unstable, too impossible in that wind. But she wasn't guessing. She'd logged this wind, mapped this mirage, knew this terrain by feel. This was the shot she'd trained for, and the one no one believed she could take. She pressed her thumb against the trigger guard, not pulling yet, just feeling the weight. Outside, the storm screamed louder. Inside, it was silent. The moment before a decision. And the decision before anyone else knew they needed one. What makes a person decide to act when every voice says don't? The storm was howling now, not a sound anymore, but a force. It clawed at the metal siding of the shack, pressed against the walls like it wanted in. The flag outside was horizontal, ripping itself apart in gusts. But inside, Quinn's world had narrowed to one thing, the small circle of glass through which everything lived or died. Her cheek rested against the stock. The smell of oil, dust, and old brass filled the air. Her breathing slowed until each inhale came like a thought she had to earn. Through the scope, the world was chaos. Mirage lines twisted like heat snakes. Visibility less than 100 meters. But she had done this 1,000 times, reading distortion, mapping invisible geometry. The prone figure across the ridge hadn't moved for 10 seconds. That was too still. Not a scout, not a wanderer. A shooter. The shape was all wrong for terrain, barrel too straight, angle too patient. She felt her left hand settle under the rifle's weight, her elbow dug in. The match shifted slightly under her ribs. The old wound near her wrist, the one from the snapped spring years ago, ached faintly in the cold. She used that feeling to gauge the air. When the pressure dropped, the scar tingled. Now it pulsed. She knew what that meant. Wind change in 3, 2, 1. The flag outside cracked like a whip. She dialed one more click left, half-breath held. The radio hissed again, command repeating the same line, do not engage. Their voices came through broken, distorted. But she wasn't listening anymore. There's a kind of silence that only comes when everything else is noise. She had it now. The rifle was steady, but her mind was louder, not with doubt but with memory. That debrief years ago, the one where her correction saved a team, but her name was missing from the report. The way the colonel looked at her, polite, detached, as if precision had no face. She had told herself then that silence was safer, that maybe being unseen meant freedom. But now, unseen meant 5 lives walking into a kill zone. Her voice came out low, not angry, not defiant, just calm. I see them. No one answered. So she acted. The trigger broke clean. No hesitation, no tremor, just breath and release. The rifle kicked back into her shoulder with a familiar thud, complete, grounded, final. For a moment the sound was devoured by the wind. No echo, no confirmation, only motion through the glass. The prone figure folded inward. Not thrown, not flailing, just gone. A single movement ending cleanly, like ink vanishing in water. Then chaos. 2 other silhouettes jerked up, searching, scrambling for cover. One fell. The others froze, unsure where death had come from. She stayed on the scope, followed them, controlled her breathing. Worked the bolt in one practiced motion. Casing out, next round in. A smooth rhythm, no rush, no adrenaline, just control. Her second shot lined up, but she didn't take it. Not yet. Because the first had done its work. The recon team below had stopped moving. They were ducked behind the rock line now, signaling, searching. They didn't know who saved them, only that the storm had just killed someone who wanted them dead. Quinn exhaled and reset her stance. The mat under her shifted slightly. Grit coated her gloves. She didn't celebrate, didn't whisper victory. This was math, not glory. The wind screamed against the shack walls again, trying to drown her in its voice. She blinked through the grit that coated her eyelashes and watched the ridge for movement. Nothing. Just silence. She held position for hours. When the storm finally broke, the light came back slowly, thin and metallic, like dawn through smoke. The ridge emerged again in fractured pieces. She could see the slope now, jagged, uneven, scarred. And a dark mark where the prone figure had been. She didn't need confirmation. The equation was closed. The next few hours passed like an afterimage. Command chatter returned. Drones came back online. The world resumed its rhythm, reports, rotations, summaries. But no one called her name. When her relief arrived near sundown, he didn't ask questions, didn't even look her in the eye, just nodded once, checked the post logs, and said, "Long day." She didn't answer. She just stood, stretched her shoulders, and packed her rifle. The path back to base was half buried in sand. Each step made a sound like paper tearing. Her ears still rang faintly, not from the gunfire, but from the storm. When she reached the main yard, the lights buzzed overhead, flickering from power flux. A truck rolled in, headlights slicing through the settling dust. The recon unit climbed down, 5 of them, dirt-streaked, exhausted, whole. She stopped walking. Watched. No one noticed her. They were talking to medics, removing helmets, reporting in. Their voices were muffled, but she could catch pieces. Took fire, ridge line, never saw where. And then one of them looked toward her, Mason Hart, sergeant, lead of that team. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just held her gaze for a single second. It was enough. He knew. Inside the command tent, the air was heavier than the storm outside. A group of officers stood around the center table, screens cycling through mission data. The storm still interfered with half the feeds. 5 personnel exfiltrated, one officer said. No injuries, 1 enemy KIA, source unverified. A red mark blinked at the bottom of the report. Unauthorized discharge detected, 14-12 hours. The operations lead frowned. Who took the shot? Silence. Quinn stood near the wall, rifle strapped across her back, dust still on her face. She stepped forward. That was my round. Heads turned. A few of them blinked, confused, maybe even irritated, like she'd interrupted something important. You were not in engagement rotation, one officer said. There was no clearance, no go command. I tracked movement for over 7 minutes, Quinn replied. Her voice didn't rise. Thermal packing across the ridge, 5 silhouettes. The prone target was setting up a scope, pattern consistent with Overwatch positioning. A younger officer, new insignia, polished boots, frowned. That ridge is over 1,200 meters, visibility near zero, no digital assist. That shot doesn't exist. Quinn didn't argue. She opened her logbook instead. It was coated in dust, the edges curled and smudged with graphite. She laid it flat on the table. Pages of wind corrections, mirage angles, terrain arcs. She turned to the page marked with a small circle. This is the ridge, she said quietly. Crosswind factor 35, mirage compression accounted for. I adjusted by feel. Someone laughed softly, the nervous kind that hides disbelief. Then Sergeant Hart's voice cut through the room. She's right. Everyone turned. He stepped forward, eyes tired but clear. That shot dropped the sniper holding our arc. We were moving into his scope. I saw the flash. Then nothing. If she hadn't fired, we'd be dead. The room stilled. Even the colonel, the one who dismissed her from active rotation weeks ago, didn't speak. He just stared at the map, tracing the arc she'd drawn with his eyes. On the mission log, the word unverified still blinked. But verification wasn't the issue anymore. Quinn didn't wait for thanks, didn't expect it. She left the room as quietly as she'd entered, the sound of her boots barely audible against the concrete floor. Outside, the wind had changed, softer now, carrying the smell of rain that never came. She paused near the flagpole. The torn fabric fluttered weakly, half gone, edges frayed. It reminded her of something, the way people unravel when ignored too long. But even frayed, the flag still moved. That was enough. Later that night, she sat on her bunk again, the rifle across her knees. She ran a cloth over the barrel, careful, deliberate, as if cleaning away the noise, not the dust. The logbook sat beside her, open to the same page, the one that proved the impossible. But she didn't look at it. She looked at the mechanical watch ticking on her crate. Tick, tick, tick. She thought about the shot, the line between choice and consequence. How quick it was. How final. She hadn't felt satisfaction, just clarity. The kind that cuts both ways. A voice came from the hall, Mason Hart again passing by. He paused at her door. "They'll come around," he said quietly. She looked up. "I don't need them to." He nodded once. "Yeah, but they should." Then he left. The sound of his boots faded down the corridor, leaving her alone again with the storm's echo. She leaned back, exhaled, and whispered the same words she'd said before it all began. "Tomorrow will hold." Because for people like Quinn, tomorrow wasn't a promise. It was a test. And she had already passed the one no one believed she could take. How does a base built on order react when the one they ignored breaks that order and ends up right? The next morning came gray and heavy. The storm had finally passed, leaving the air thick with dust that clung to everything, the tents, the trucks, the skin. The desert had that look it always got after a night of chaos, clean and ruined at the same time. Quinn sat alone at the edge of the range. The world was quieter than usual. Not peaceful, just uncertain, like even the wind hadn't decided which direction it wanted to go. Her rifle lay open on the table. She wasn't cleaning it this time. She just looked at it, the metal dulled from use, the small scratches along the barrel where her glove sometimes slipped. It wasn't pride, it was recognition. That weapon had never been about trust in command. It had always been about trust in herself. And now the math had proven her right, but at a cost. Because being right in the wrong way has a price. Inside the command tent there was movement again. New reports, debriefs. The same faces, the same hierarchy, except now her name was on their lips, even if they didn't say it out loud. The colonel had spent half the night reviewing wind logs, ballistic data, and drone timestamps. The pieces didn't line up until they did, and when they did, they pointed to one thing. Her shot. No authorization, no command clearance. But the range, the wind, the timing, it was all there. And the bodies of the recon team were not. That silence, the one she had lived with for years, now sat in the colonel's office instead. He didn't know what to do with it. By noon, an assistant brought Quinn a folded form. "Operations request," he said, not meeting her eyes. She signed it without asking what it was. She didn't need to know. Paper never told the real story. He hovered a moment longer, like he wanted to say something else but didn't. Then he left. She watched him go, then looked at the sky washed pale, featureless. She wondered how long it would take before anyone spoke to her directly again. That evening she walked past the yard where the younger trainees were packing up their drills. She could feel their glances, quick, uncertain, not mocking anymore, just cautious. No one laughed this time. The jokes about museum glass had gone quiet. Silence, the same silence that once pushed her out, now followed her wherever she went. And silence can feel heavy, even when it's made of respect. In the mess tent, the air buzzed with low conversation. Soldiers swapping stories they didn't understand. Someone took a long shot through the storm. Commands rewriting the range brackets. No one knows who fired. Quinn walked in, grabbed her tray, and sat at the end of the row. No one sat beside her, but this time no one got up either. That was new. She ate slowly, listening. The rumors had grown legs. Some said it was luck, others called it instinct. Only one word never appeared: discipline. And that was the part they'd never understand. Later that night, she found herself outside again, near the storage bays. The stars were faint, the kind of night sky you get when the air's still full of storm residue. She leaned against the wall and listened to the bass breathe, the hum of generators, the low thud of boots, the sound of 1,000 people moving like a single uncertain thought. That's when the colonel appeared. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain field jacket and a look she couldn't quite read: tired, cautious, maybe ashamed. "Sergeant Quinn," he said. His tone was clipped like he'd practiced saying it right. She straightened. "Sir." He didn't answer immediately, just looked at the rifle slung across her shoulder, the same one he'd called obsolete 2 months ago when she failed her digital recalibration trial. "I reviewed your log," he said finally. "You factored wind correction by sound." "Yes, sir." He nodded once, "And by feel." She met his eyes. "Yes, sir." He looked down, thumb running over the seam of his jacket. The wind picked up again, brushing dust against his boots. "That's not standard procedure," he said quietly. "No, sir." He exhaled, a sound halfway between disbelief and resignation. "Then maybe our standards need to change." He turned to leave but stopped halfway, as if something still pulled at him. "For what it's worth," he added, "you saved 5 of mine." Then he walked away. She didn't move for a long time, just stood there, the storm ghost still whispering across the desert. It wasn't praise, not really, but it was the first time in a long time someone said hers and mine in the same sentence. And sometimes, that's enough to start mending a crack you stopped believing could heal. The following morning, word spread fast, quietly, unofficially. The base's internal training files were being reviewed. Long-range doctrines flagged for wind anomaly recalibration. Someone was rewriting the math. They didn't say who, but Quinn knew. You can tell when the world starts echoing something you once said into the void. A day later, she opened her locker and froze. Her logbook, the one she'd left on the bench after the debrief, was back. Only it wasn't exactly the same. The pages had been straightened, smudges wiped clean. And on the inside cover, a small tag was attached. "Copied for internal review, training reference material." Her throat tightened, but she didn't smile. Recognition didn't always come as a medal. Sometimes it came as proof that your handwriting mattered. That afternoon, a junior range technician stopped her near the gates. He looked nervous, fumbling with a clipboard. "They wanted to know," he said carefully, "if you could maybe write out your wind method. Just for internal use. No signature required." Quinn blinked, almost amused. "My method?" He nodded. "Just a paragraph or two, doesn't have to be official," Command said. He stopped. Actually, they didn't say much, just they asked. She took the clipboard, tore off a page and wrote. Simple, straightforward, no theory, no speech. Listen to the world before you measure it. She handed it back. The technician stared at the line, not sure what it meant, but he'd figure it out one day. Later in her bunk, she found something folded under her pillow. No header, no name, just a line in pencil. "You don't need permission for what you did." She stared at it for a while, then folded it again and slipped it between the final pages of her logbook. The words weren't from the colonel. They weren't from heart either. She didn't know who wrote them, maybe no one. But she kept them anyway. Over the next few days, something shifted. Not loudly, quietly, the way dust settles after the wind. People moved differently when she passed. The sideways glances softened. The jokes stopped. No one said thank you, but they made room for her in line. And that was enough. The same young officer who'd questioned her at the debrief nodded once when she entered the range yard. Just a nod, but genuine. Respect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just steps aside. At dusk, Quinn returned to the shack, her storage unit, as the manifest still called it. The flag outside was calm again, hanging limp against the pole. The air was golden, warm, quiet. She laid her rifle on the mat, just as she always did, and looked through the scope. The ridge where it had all happened still shimmered under the setting light. The mark was still there, faint, distant, part of the landscape now. She watched it for a long time. Then softly, almost like a breath, "I told you tomorrow would hold." The desert didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because this time it listened. In the stillness, she realized something simple. Being invisible had never been her punishment. It was her training. Silence had taught her to see what others missed. Doubt had sharpened her patience. And the storm, when it came, had simply revealed what she already was. A steady hand. A quiet certainty. A truth no order could silence. When does silence stop being isolation and start becoming presence? It began subtly, the shift. A week after the storm, Quinn noticed it first in the air, not in the way the wind moved, but in how people did. They didn't avoid her anymore. They didn't rush to speak either. They just left room. A space that hadn't been there before. And sometimes, space is the most powerful apology there is. The range felt different now. The same dust, same drills, same worn concrete and distant echoes, but something had changed. The gunners stopped their jokes mid-sentence when she passed, not out of guilt, out of awareness. The kind that only comes when the unthinkable happens and forces people to see what they'd overlooked. The colonel still hadn't said much since that night. He didn't have to. There are some acknowledgments that live better in silence. Quinn didn't chase them. She still reported at 600, still checked her scope, logged the wind, tested her bolt. Routine didn't need an audience. But in the quiet she could feel eyes on her, not mocking now, just curious. The kind of curiosity that comes when truth rewrites its own story. It was Mason Hart who approached her first. He found her sitting near the supply crates one morning, flipping through her logbook. He stood there for a while before speaking. "You're still writing." She looked up, then back at the page. "The wind doesn't stop." He chuckled softly. "You know that shot you changed things. Commands revising long-range parameters. They're using your notes." "I heard," she said. He leaned against the post, studying her face. "They'll make it sound like doctrine, like it came from a boardroom." "Doesn't matter," she said. Hart nodded slowly. "It should." She didn't answer, just turned another page. He waited, then finally said, "You ever think maybe you were meant to be the one they overlooked? Because no one else would have seen what you saw that day." Quinn didn't look up. "Maybe," she said, "but maybe I was just the one who stayed." He smiled at that, quiet, small reel. Then he pushed off the post and walked away. Later that day, she caught sight of the colonel near the motor pool. He was talking to a logistics officer, but his eyes flicked to her once briefly. No nod, no salute, just a look that held the weight of a changed mind. She'd never needed his words. But seeing respect in the eyes of someone who once doubted you, it settles differently. Like gravity returning to its rightful pull. By midweek, the training yard started to fill again. Fresh faces, new recruits, their voices carried across the field, young and eager, full of the energy that comes before disillusionment. Quinn watched them from the sidelines, not officially an instructor, just present. She could see their movements, their habits, their mistakes. Too quick on the scope, too impatient with drift, too reliant on numbers they didn't understand. She saw herself in them. The way she used to chase precision like it was something you could earn instead of something you could become. That night, she stayed late on the range, remeasuring wind arcs for the next morning's drill. She didn't notice she wasn't alone until she heard a small, hesitant voice behind her. "Ma'am." She turned. A trainee stood there barely out of his teens, nervous, cap tucked tight under his arm. He held out a notebook. "Is it true you calculate drift without sensors?" She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Sometimes." He hesitated, shifting his weight. "I was wondering, could you show me, just how you track the wind before it shows up?" She looked at the notebook, blank, clean pages waiting for someone to make them matter. "Tomorrow," she said, 600, bring your pencil." The boy smiled, quick, relieved, and walked off, nearly tripping over a crate. Quinn watched him go. Then she closed her own logbook and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow will hold." Again. The next morning came bright, the kind of light that feels too sharp to be kind. The range shimmered with rising heat. Quinn stood beside the trainee as he set up his scope, clumsy but eager. He adjusted the sight wrong. She didn't correct him immediately. She let him feel it first. When the reticle drifted off target, he frowned. "Now?" he asked. She shook her head. "Watch the flag." He blinked. "There's no wind." "Not yet," she said. "That's the point." He frowned deeper, then stared. The flag hung limp for a long time. Then barely a twitch. The smallest pulse of motion. "There," she whispered. "The wind breaks before it breathes. If you wait for the sound, you're late." He nodded slowly, writing it down like scripture. Word spread, not through official memos but through whispers and imitation. Soon 2 more trainees showed up at her post, then 5. She didn't call it teaching, she just called it presence. They asked questions carefully, afraid of saying too much, and she'd answer just enough. No lectures, no ego, just the work. How to listen to the air. How to read the dust. How to understand what silence means before it becomes danger. It wasn't the kind of training that showed up on reports, but it stayed. And in that quiet corner of the base, something rare began to grow, respect not built from authority, but from example. One afternoon, after a long session, she returned to her locker. The range was empty, the sun dropping low, the air painted in shades of copper. She opened the locker to put away her gear and froze. Inside, resting neatly in the foam lining, was a rifle she had never seen before. Long barrel, precision mount, brand new. Still tagged for calibration. A small red card hung from the bolt, eyes on. No name, no paperwork. But etched discreetly on the stock, near the trigger housing, were 2 letters. QD. Her initials. She stood there for a long time, the metal catching the sunset like liquid fire. She didn't touch it at first, just stared. Because gifts like that didn't need explanation. Finally, she ran her fingers along the bolt, soft, slow, the new metal cold against her skin. Then she closed the lid gently. She didn't bring it to the range the next morning. Not yet. It would wait. Instead, she went back to the trainees. They were already there, notebooks open, eyes alert. One of them, the same boy from before, asked her what made her stay that day in the storm, when command told her not to shoot. She looked at him for a long moment. Then said, because someone had to see past the noise. He didn't understand it fully, not yet. But he nodded anyway. She watched him aim, steady his breathing, correct his angle. The shot went wide. He looked disappointed. Quinn smiled faintly. "Good, you missed." He blinked. "Good. Now you know what the wind can do when it thinks you're not watching." He laughed softly. The others smiled too. And for the first time in a long time, the air around her felt lighter. That night, she sat outside near the perimeter wall, the desert stretching endless before her. The wind had gone still. The stars were sharp and cold. She thought about the letter. The colonel's silence. The rifle in her locker. The boy with the notebook. She thought about how strange it was that the world only starts listening after you've already acted. She didn't resent it anymore. She just understood it. Because not all storms are weather, some are waiting. And some you outlast simply by standing still until the noise forgets how to move you. When the breeze finally came again, she smiled. Just a small, private curve of the mouth. "Tomorrow will hold," she whispered once more. And this time she knew it would. What happens when your silence starts to echo louder than every command? Weeks passed, but the memory of the storm never really left. It lived in the air, in the color of the dust, in the way soldiers looked toward the ridge before stepping onto the range. They didn't talk about it directly, not the shot, not the storm, not her. But it was there, quiet as breath. Sometimes a base remembers differently than people do. Quinn kept her same schedule. 600 range check, 1,200 recalibration logs, 1,800 observation drills. No medal, no reassignment, just work. And that was all she wanted. But something new had started, something she didn't plan. The recruits came in groups now, not ordered, not assigned, just drawn. They called her ma'am, or sometimes sergeant, though she never reminded them of rank. They treated her post like a classroom, the kind without desks or lectures, just sand, wind, and attention. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to, because when someone's earned silence through action, people lean in to hear it. One morning, the colonel walked across the yard. He moved like a man used to being obeyed, not questioned. The chatter quieted before he even reached her post. Quinn was lying prone beside a trainee, showing him how to sight along a ridge break. She didn't look up when the colonel's shadow crossed the mat. "Sergeant Quinn," he said. His tone was formal but softer than before. "Sir." He paused, watching the boy adjust his aim. "You're training them now." "Not officially," she said. "They asked." He nodded once slow. "And you said yes." "I said tomorrow." The faintest smile crossed his face. "You always do." He crouched beside them, squinting through the horizon. "They're saying you teach wind like it's alive." Quinn's expression didn't change. "It is, sir." He tilted his head, almost curious. "And what about command?" She finally looked at him. "Command changes slower than weather." He studied her a long moment, then stood. "Keep doing what you're doing. Just make sure they write it down this time." Then he left, boots crunching in the dust. The boy beside her whispered, "Was that permission?" Quinn smiled faintly. "Call it direction." That afternoon, the wind began to rise again, slow at first, gentle. The kind of shift only she noticed. By 1500, the range flags were twitching. By 1600, they were whipping full horizontal. Another storm brewing. The trainees looked uneasy. The air itself seemed to hum, the kind of tension that happens when the desert starts remembering what it's capable of. She stood in the center of the yard, scanning the horizon. The light had turned strange again, that flat, metallic color that erases depth and distance. The ridge line flickered under distortion. "Pack up the electronics," she said calmly. "Manual drills only." They hesitated. One of the recruits spoke up, "But the sensors." She cut him off gently. "Won't matter when the storm blinds them. Learn to see without them." The base intercom crackled overhead, calling for lockdown prep. But the recruits didn't leave, not yet. They stayed near her, waiting for what she'd do. She pointed toward the far flag. "Watch it. Tell me what the dust says." They looked confused, but did as told. The first gust came hard, slicing through the air like a blade. Dust lifted, curved, spun in a spiral. "What direction?" she asked. "East," one yelled. "Wrong," she said softly. "That's the echo. The real wind breaks from the north." A pause, and then, sure enough, the second gust came from behind them, snapping the flag the other way. The boy who'd answered looked shocked. How did you? Because the desert tells you, she said. You just have to stop arguing with it. The storm hit full within minutes, the air filled with grit so dense it tasted like metal. She guided them through it, not by shouting but by movement. Each signal clear practiced. Hand to the ground, wait, 2 fingers reposition, palm open, breathe. They followed her rhythm, their panic replaced by focus. And as visibility dropped to near zero, the recruits, once afraid of silence, now relied on it. The storm roared, but inside that chaos they were still. When it passed hours later, the yard was unrecognizable, dunes where pavement had been, crates half buried, flags shredded. But no one was hurt. No equipment lost. No panic. Just order. The colonel found them that evening. He looked around the yard, at the young soldiers brushing dust off their rifles, smiling tiredly. You kept them steady, he said. Quinn just nodded. They followed you, he added, even without orders. They didn't follow me, she said. They followed what they'd learned. He looked at her for a long moment, then exhaled. That's leadership, Sergeant. She didn't answer. The word felt too heavy to claim. But when he walked away, she allowed herself one small thought. Maybe leadership wasn't about being heard. Maybe it was about being worth listening to when it finally mattered. That night the base was quiet again, the kind of stillness that comes only after chaos has burned itself out. Quinn sat by her bunk with her logbook open. The last few pages were filled not with her notes, but with the handwriting of her trainees. Their own observations, their first attempts at reading the world. Some lines were wrong, some were naive. But they were trying. And trying, she knew, was where every soldier begins. She flipped to a page, marked with a new line she hadn't written. Wind doesn't hide, we just forget to listen. She smiled faintly. One of them had written it, probably the same boy who once thought silence meant weakness. Maybe he'd figured out that silence can be a kind of strength too. At 2300, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Mason Hart standing there again, holding something in his hand, a small case. This came through supply, he said. New optics for that rifle they gave you. She looked at the case, then at him. You sure it's not someone else's paperwork mistake? He grinned. If it is, I'm not correcting it. She took the case, feeling its weight. You know they'll never say it out loud. Hart shrugged. They don't have to. Everyone saw what happened in that storm today. You built something they can't undo. He hesitated, then added, You ever think about training full-time? She raised an eyebrow, teaching. He nodded. They're talking about starting a precision program. Word is, they want someone who's proven that instinct still matters. Quinn didn't answer right away. She looked past him at the quiet range beyond the tents, at the flag now hanging limp again. Finally, she said, Instinct's just another word for memory that doesn't need permission. Hart smiled. Then maybe it's time they started remembering. After he left, she opened the case. Inside, a compact scope gleamed sleek, new, balanced. But when she held it, she still felt the weight of her old rifle in her hands, that imperfect steel that had carried her through silence and disbelief. She set the new optics aside. Some things, she thought, don't need upgrades. She reached instead for the folded note in her logbook, the one she'd kept since that day. You don't need permission for what you did. She read it once, then tucked it back between the pages. Outside, the night wind stirred again, brushing against the shack like a familiar voice. Quinn closed her eyes and listened. It wasn't the storm this time. It was calm. Earned calm. The kind that only comes after every question has been answered by action. And in that quiet she smiled, small, certain, unshakable. Because the wind would always come back. And when it did, she'd be ready. How do you keep your balance when the same system that once silenced you suddenly wants your voice? 2 weeks after the storm, the desert settled back into its ordinary rhythm, heat by day, cold by night, drills that ran on clockwork. But nothing about base life felt ordinary anymore. Everywhere Quinn went, someone was watching, not out of suspicion, out of expectation. The colonel's offhand comment, "Keep doing what you're doing," had become permission no one wanted to say aloud. Now the recruits arrived before sunrise. They lined up by her shack, notebooks in hand, waiting for lessons that weren't in any manual. And every morning she looked at them and thought, they're not waiting for orders. They're waiting for proof that instinct still belongs here. One dawn, she found the colonel standing at the edge of the range. No entourage, no clipboard, just him, hands behind his back, eyes fixed on the trainees lying prone in the sand. He didn't interrupt. He watched as Quinn guided them through breath control, short inhales, long releases, like conversation with the earth. When the drill ended, he approached. "You've built something," he said. She wiped grit from her hands. "I just reminded them how to listen." He looked down at the spent casings glinting in the sun. "Command's noticed. They're sending an inspection team next week. Training division wants to formalize your program." Quinn froze. Formalize. That word always meant taking something alive and locking it into a binder. "What happens when they formalize it?" she asked. "They give it a name, a department, a budget." "And rules," she added. He didn't deny it. "Rules keep people safe." Her eyes met his. "Rules also told me not to fire." For a second neither spoke. Then he nodded slowly, as if conceding a quiet truth. "Maybe you'll write better ones." The week passed in a blur of drills and paperwork. Quinn hated paperwork. It turned movement into numbers, and numbers into something people could argue with. Still, she filled the forms, drew diagrams, explained her method. "Listen before you measure. Trust pattern, not prediction. Silence isn't absence, it's data." The words looked strange on the page, too clean, too certain. She wondered if they'd still mean the same once printed in ink instead of graphite. On the fourth day, a message arrived. Inspection advanced. Arrival within 24 hours. The trainees caught wind of it before she did. Anxiety spread fast, faster than truth ever did. "What if they shut us down?" one asked. "What if they think this is wrong?" Quinn smiled faintly. "Then we'll keep doing it right until they notice." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat on her bunk, turning her father's old cloth over in her hands. It still smelled faintly of oil and dust, the scent of hours spent cleaning lenses he'd called trust machines. She thought of what he once told her. A rifle isn't an extension of the body, it's an extension of discipline. He'd never lived to see her serve. Maybe that was why she stayed so long in silence, because she was still proving something to someone who wasn't there to see it. The inspection team arrived the next morning in a convoy of clean trucks that looked allergic to dirt. 3 officers in polished boots stepped out. They carried tablets and the kind of expressions that made people forget how to breathe. The colonel greeted them, all formality and clipped smiles. Then he turned to Quinn. "They'll start with your trainees." She nodded once. The team spread out, taking notes, whispering to each other. One of them, younger, crisp uniform, approached her firing line. "You're the one who made the shot," he said, "not a question." She didn't confirm or deny it. He gestured at the trainees. "You've replaced digital readings with intuition." "Observation," she corrected. He tapped his stylus. "That's not measurable." She met his gaze. "Neither is survival until it fails." He blinked, not sure how to record that. They stayed the entire day, watching every drill, every breath, every correction. Quinn said little. She let the results speak. By evening, the wind returned. Not a storm this time, just enough to test precision. The inspectors wanted demonstration shots. The recruits looked nervous. Quinn stepped behind the first trainee, the same boy who'd once thought silence was weakness. His hands shook as he adjusted the scope. "Forget the noise," she whispered. "Find the stillness inside it." He steadied, fired. The target clanged 800 meters out. Then again. And again. The inspectors leaned forward. She didn't smile. She just moved to the next shooter, guiding, correcting, letting the rhythm carry. By the time the last round hit home, the yard was silent except for the soft hiss of wind across sand. Afterward, one inspector approached. "You realize this doesn't fit current doctrine." Quinn nodded. It didn't fit the storm either. He hesitated, then lowered his tablet. "You may be onto something, Sergeant." That was all he said, but it was enough. When the convoy left at sunset, the colonel found her near the range gate. "You did well," he said. "They'll file their report, but I doubt anyone will argue now." She glanced at the horizon. "They will eventually, they always do." "Then you'll prove them wrong again." She looked at him, half smiling. "And if I'm not here?" He paused. "Then they'll have your students." That night she wrote a final line in her logbook. "Legacy isn't noise that lasts. It's quiet that others learn to trust." Then she closed it and set it aside. The next morning, she didn't go to the range right away. Instead, she walked out toward the ridge, the one where she'd taken the shot that started all of this. The sand had shifted since then. The mark was gone. She knelt anyway, pressing her palm to the ground. Wind moved faintly across her fingers, cool and steady. She realized she didn't need the mark anymore. The memory lived elsewhere now, in notebooks, in lessons, in the way recruits breathed before firing. She stood, brushed dust from her hands, and whispered, "Hold steady." Not to herself this time, to whatever would come next. That evening, when she returned to base, she found an envelope slipped under her door. No seal, no name, just a small emblem stamped on the corner, "Training Division." Inside, a single sheet. Effective immediately. Sergeant Quinn Turner appointed lead instructor, Precision Field Observation Program. At the bottom, an unsigned note in pencil. "Keep teaching them to listen." She folded it carefully, slid it between the pages of her logbook, and exhaled. For years she had waited to be seen. Now she was not as the exception but as the example. Later she sat on the steps outside her shack, the new rifle beside her, the old one leaning against her knee. The sky above burned orange, fading into violet. She thought about storms, how they come, how they leave, how they change the shape of everything without asking. And she thought about silence, how it isn't emptiness at all. It's patience. It's proof. Because the quietest things often survive the longest. When the night finally fell, she looked out across the range one last time and whispered a line that had become her truth. "Tomorrow will hold." And this time it wasn't a hope. It was a fact. How do you know your lessons have taken root? When they act without you, or when they wait for your word? The range looked different now. The paint on the targets was new, the perimeter lined with fresh flags, a sign that headquarters had finally noticed what the desert already knew. Quinn's name had appeared on rosters, bulletins, even requisition forms, printed in ink, not graphite. But recognition never sat comfortably on her shoulders. She still began her mornings before the sun rose, winding her brass watch by feel, the small click of gears grounding her in rhythm. The base woke later now, with a cadence that followed her example, deliberate, quiet, efficient. Her trainees, the first true class of the Precision Field Observation Program, moved across the sand in practiced stillness. They carried new rifles, polished scopes, all factory fresh. But beneath the shine lived an idea born in wind and grit. Listen before you measure. Trust the world to tell you where it's breaking. They repeated those words the way soldiers recite creeds. She never called it doctrine, she called it remembering. The colonel came by less these days, not out of distance, out of respect. He understood now that leadership didn't always live behind a desk. But higher command noticed too, and with notice came scrutiny. A message arrived from headquarters, a field evaluation, not an inspection this time, a live exercise. 3 platoons, real conditions, partial communication blackout. Her trainees would operate under her system, no sensors, no drones. It was meant to prove the program's value, or expose its flaws. Quinn read the directive twice, then folded it away. She didn't fear failure. She feared bureaucracy turning intuition into checklist. Still, she agreed. Because truth, she knew, only holds when it's tested. The morning of the exercise came pale and windless. The desert waited, suspended in that eerie calm that always felt like a held breath. Quinn briefed her team, 8 of her best, the ones who had learned patience instead of performance. Among them was the boy from before, the one who'd once asked how to see the wind before it came. Now his stance was steady, his eyes clear. Remember, she told them, no one's watching for medals today, just results. He grinned, you mean survival. She almost smiled, that too. They moved out, each pair taking positions across the ridges. She remained at base command, her role this time not to act, but to watch them act. And that was harder than any shot she'd ever taken. By mid-afternoon, the sky began to change. The weather forecast had promised clear visibility. But the horizon told another story, heat shimmer bending light in strange arcs, distant haze thickening into motion. Quinn stepped outside the control tent, tasting grit on the air. The colonel joined her, eyes narrowing, storm front. Not yet, she said, but close. He frowned. Command didn't authorize contingency prep. She looked toward the ridge. Storms don't wait for permission. The radio crackled, short bursts of static, then a young voice. Visibility dropping on grid 4, instruments glitching. Quinn's stomach tightened. She recognized the voice. It was the same trainee who'd once asked her to teach him the wind. Hold position, she said calmly. Don't trust the instruments, use your sightlines. A pause, then copy. She could hear the tremor in his tone, the fine edge between fear and focus. The storm rolled faster than any forecast could have predicted. By 1600 hours, the horizon disappeared. The wind carved sound into shape. Inside the control tent, officers scrambled, switching frequencies, cursing interference. Quinn ignored them. She closed her eyes, counting between gusts, reading the rhythm through sound alone. The colonel turned to her. We're losing visuals. She nodded. They know what to do. Without you. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Outside, the sky turned the color of ash. Minutes stretched. Reports came half-broken, voices cut by static. Then sudden clarity. Contact on ridge line, possible crossfire. We're pinned. Quinn moved to the radio. Who's speaking? Grid 4, Team Delta. Her pulse slowed, not quickened. She imagined their position, the line of sight, the angles, the probable wind vectors inside a sand wall. She spoke into the static. Check the flag markers. Which way are they pulling? A pause. Then the boy's voice. No flags, ma'am, they're gone. She closed her eyes, then listened. Feel it, she said softly. Your cheek, your sleeve, the edge of your glove. The wind tells you where it wants to take the shot. Don't fight it, guide it. Another pause. Then quieter. I think I see it. Seconds passed. The tent was silent but for wind and breath. Then a single distant crack echoed through the radio feed, followed by stillness. No return fire, no chaos. Just a voice, faint but steady. Target down, team clear. Quinn exhaled slowly. The colonel's jaw unclenched. Your student. She nodded once, hours now. When the storm finally passed, the field team returned coated in dust, exhausted but alive. Their faces carried that mix of disbelief and pride that only comes from surviving what they weren't supposed to. The young shooter approached her first, removing his goggles, eyes raw from sand. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I always do." He handed her a small scrap torn from his notebook. On it, he'd written one line. "I didn't measure, I listened." She folded it and tucked it into her pocket. "Then you understand." Later that night, after the debrief, she sat on the steps of her shack again. The storm had left the world reshaped, sand ridges new, paths erased. The colonel joined her quietly. "You know," he said, "command already requesting a report. They want to know how your trainee made that call." "Tell them he followed orders," she said. He raised an eyebrow. He didn't have any. She turned to him. "Exactly." He chuckled. "You're still teaching rebellion." "No," she said softly, "responsibility." They sat in silence for a long moment. The night was cool, the stars sharp. Finally, he said, "You've built something that will outlive you." She looked toward the ridge. "That's the only kind worth building." He nodded, then stood to leave. Before walking off, he added, "They'll name the program after someone one day." "Then name it after the wind," she said. "It did most of the work." When he was gone, she pulled the small scrap of paper from her pocket again. The handwriting was crooked, the words uneven. "I didn't measure, I listened." She read it twice, then slipped it between the final pages of her logbook, just behind the old note. "You don't need permission for what you did." The two pieces of paper touched, one from the past, one from the future. She smiled. The desert shifted outside, wind whispering across the barracks, not fierce this time, gentle, approving, alive. And in that quiet rhythm, Quinn realized something. Her silence had never been loneliness. It had been preparation, for the moment someone else would finally hear what she'd been hearing all along. When she closed her eyes, she could almost feel it again. The moment before her own shot, the breath between disbelief and decision. Now it wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the ones who had listened. How do you know a chapter over when the noise fades or when the silence feels like home? The base woke under silver light that morning, the kind that makes every shadow look deliberate. It was inspection day again. But this time, Quinn wasn't the one being inspected. Her trainees, now full field operators, stood lined across the range, rifles slung, boots sunk halfway into sand. Each carried a wind gauge on their wrist, a manual compass in their pocket, and something unseen in their posture: certainty. She watched them from the edge of the yard, arms folded, hat brim low. They didn't look toward her for approval anymore. And that, she thought, was the truest measure of success. The colonel joined her quietly. He didn't need introduction anymore. His presence had softened with time. "They're ready," he said. "They were ready yesterday," she answered. He smiled faintly, still humble. She shrugged, still practical. He glanced down at the sand. Command approved the program's full integration. Field Observation Protocol Codename, Mirage Doctrine. Quinn raised an eyebrow. They gave it a name. "They gave it your math," he said. "Every formula, every page you ever wrote, it's all in there." She didn't reply. Words like doctrine always made her uneasy. Doctrine turned instinct into policy, and policy turned truth into something to argue about. But for once, she didn't feel the need to protect it. Because the proof was standing on the range, 8 soldiers breathing with the rhythm of the wind, not against it. The colonel handed her a folder. Inside was a single sheet, a reassignment order. "Training Division, Northern Command. You'll oversee expansion," he said. "Bigger budget, more staff, less sand." Quinn traced a thumb over the seal, then closed the folder. "I belong here," she said simply. He nodded, not surprised. "I figured you'd say that. Still, you've earned the right to choose." She handed the folder back. "I already did." He smiled, almost proud. "Then I'll tell them the wind kept you." The afternoon drifted by in soft heat. The trainees ran drills, laughter breaking between bursts of focus. It sounded strange here, laughter. It had been a long time since she'd heard it ring without tension. The boy, the one from the ridge, now older, sharper, approached her during cool-down. "Ma'am, rumor says they're building a memorial on the North Ridge, the storm site." She looked up. "For who?" He hesitated. "For whoever fired that day." She almost laughed. "Let them build it for the wind. It carried the round." He smiled, shaking his head. "You'll never take credit, will you?" Quinn watched the horizon, the ridge now softened by distance. Credit fades, lessons don't. That evening, as the sun dropped, she walked out alone beyond the barrier wall. The desert stretched endless, painted gold and rust, the kind of beauty that hides its danger in stillness. She stopped where the old shack once stood, the one they'd nearly torn down years ago. Now only the post anchors remained, half buried. She knelt and brushed sand away until metal met air. The ground still smelled faintly of oil and time. From her pocket, she pulled the folded scrap of paper her student had written. "I didn't measure, I listened." She placed it against the post, pressing it down with a flat stone. Then beside it she tucked another. The old note from years before. "You don't need permission for what you did." Past and future, buried together beneath the same dust. The wind rose, soft, almost affectionate. When she returned to base, the colonel was waiting by the gate. "Out walking ghosts again?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "They walk fine without me." He studied her for a moment. "You ever think about how different this place would have been if we just listened sooner?" "Every day," she said, "but listening late is still listening." He nodded slowly. "You taught us that." Night came early. The range lights hummed. Quinn sat on the steps of her quarters, her old rifle beside her, its metal dulled to matte gray. She ran a cloth along the bolt, the same one she'd used the night before that storm so long ago. Her hands moved by memory, each motion exact, unhurried. The sound of the wind against the panels reminded her of that day, the crack of sand on tin, the breath before the shot, the moment the world didn't believe her until it had to. But this time there was no bitterness, only understanding. Because that single act hadn't been defiance. It had been faith, faith in her craft, in her preparation, in the quiet parts of herself no one had ever tried to understand. And faith, she realized, is just discipline without witnesses. From down the hall came the low voices of her trainees, trading jokes, comparing notes, laughing. She listened, eyes half closed. The sound filled the space where loneliness used to live. She didn't need to join them. She just needed to know they were still out there, watching, listening, steady. The world would move on. New recruits would come. They'd learn from the manuals now, from words she never wrote but inspired. They'd never know her voice, but they'd follow her rhythm. And that, she thought, was enough. Near midnight, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find the young soldier again, helmet tucked under one arm. "Ma'am," he said, almost hesitant, "they're asking what motto to engrave on the new range gate." She tilted her head. "Motto?" "Yes, ma'am. Something to remind the next class what this place stands for." She thought for a moment, then said quietly, "Tell them this, silence isn't absence, it's readiness." He nodded, committing it to memory. As he turned to leave, she added, "And make sure they spell it right. The wind's watching." He laughed softly. "Yes, ma'am." When the door closed, Quinn sat back on her bunk. The logbook lay open beside her. edges frayed, graphite smudged, a lifetime written in wind and patience. She turned to the very last page. It was blank. She stared at it for a while, then picked up her pencil. No numbers this time, no angles. Just words. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She underlined it once softly, then set the pencil down. Outside, the wind returned, steady, quiet, constant. It slipped through the cracks of the walls, brushed over her hair, and carried through the room like a voice made of air. It wasn't a storm anymore. It was memory. It was proof. And as she closed her eyes, the final thought came, not loud, not triumphant, just true. The world had dismissed her shot in the storm, and then rebuilt its silence around it.